guys. Welcome back to Bible Unplugged. I'm Wave Nunnally, and we're in the middle of a series on back to basics, going back to the fundamentals or the building blocks of our faith, our relationship with God. In this series, you've got a number of the names of episodes that are coming up. We've already done is our natural inclination toward good or evil. Is man's nature fundamentally preset toward rebellion against the ways of God and righteousness, or preset in the direction of God? This we did last segment. I want to encourage you to take a look at that. In fact, even before you go into these subsequent episodes of this series, because that is just such a fundamental starting point. What is the nature of man, and are we preset more in the direction of making good choices or bad? What we're going to be looking at today is the consequences of rebellion against God, mutiny against God. There will be others that will follow in this series, and I'm looking forward to sharing that material with you in due time. So in this part 2, we're looking at original sin, the sin of Adam and Eve that we then inherit, and all of that is covered in the first segment of this series, and its result in the consequences of rebellion, the consequences that come to us as a result of our mutiny against God. And this is, by every metric, a flyover. This is a sort of an overview. We don't have time to do all of the consequences, nor do we have time to cover all Bible passages, etc., that deal with each one of these consequences. But the first one, our fallen nature is inherited. Again, go back to that first segment in this series. But we have from the prophet Hosea that we're like Adam, who transgressed the covenant, and we have dealt treacherously with God, or in our relationship with God. Skipping to the intertestamental period. And by the way, let me just give you a quick explanation as to why we introduce into these kinds of discussions material that is outside the Bible, between the Testaments, etc. First of all, we just want to expose you to that material because most other people don't. And that's the reason we put them on the screen, so you're able to see the same words that we see when we're coming to our conclusions. Another reason is we want to show the continuity of these points of faith, these aspects of what people are believing from the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament all the way through the intertestamental period and then into the New Testament. Our third reason why we want to introduce this material into our discussion is because this stuff will take us through that 450 to 500 years between Malachi and Matthew and help us to understand some of the influences on some of the developmental steps that are taking place in the development of an institution or word usage, or in this situation, a belief, a component of belief system, and that then has impact on the way that New Testament authors express themselves. We're not trying to turn this into Bible, not trying to add to the canon, that list of sacred scriptures of the Bible, but this is simply ancient data that helps us connect the dots between Old and New Testament. So, 4th Ezra, from around the time of the New Testament, written by a traditional Jewish author. "Oh, Adam, what have you done? It was you who sinned, but the fall wasn't yours alone. It was ours also." So there's this inherited proclivity toward, or inclination toward, rebellion against God. The rabbis, the early rabbis, will also say, why is it that the Gentiles are contaminated with lust? What is it that connects all these dots? Why is everybody like that? When the serpent came upon Eve, the serpent instilled contaminating lust into her. So again, like with 4th Ezra, so also with the early rabbis. They're going back to this original covenant infraction or incident that caused this rift between God and his the apex of his created order, man, and that then goes downstream all the way to us. Now, no wonder then why in the New Testament Paul will say that it's just through one man that sin entered into the world, and then death came through sin. We'll deal with this in another component of this presentation today. And then death spread to everybody because everybody sinned. So there's Paul on that. Another result of the fall, a result of Adam and Eve's rebellion against God, is separation. You could also call it estrangement or alienation between God and man. So you get this in that first incident in Genesis chapter 3, what's called original sin, or the sin in the garden. When they heard the sound of Yahweh God walking in the garden, then the man and his wife hid. There's that separation, that alienation. They knew something was out of order. They hid themselves from the presence of God. And so God called out to the man, "Where are you? Why is it that you have hidden yourself from me? I was afraid, and so I hid." This is that original expression of alienation, but then watch how you get it. It's said in other ways by different authors as we move through biblical revelation. In Psalm 58, the wicked are estranged from the womb. Estranged from whom? From God, from the Creator, from the one that wants to communicate with us. Now, these who speak lies, they go astray from birth. So again, there's that attitude of we're born into this. It's not just by nature and nurture, but rather there's this human proclivity or inclination toward moving away from instead of in the direction of God. Isaiah 53 mentions this kind of estrangement or alienation. We've all gone astray. We've all turned to our own way. Then in Isaiah 59, and this is a real key passage for this aspect of alienation or separation. Your sins, your iniquities, have made a separation between you and your God. Then he turns around and says it another way, your sins have hidden his face from you. There is some breach of relationship due to this covenant infraction or breaking of the agreement between God and man. The prophet also, Ezekiel, will say, those of the house of Israel who are estranged from me, separating themselves from me by what? Setting up idols in his heart, by disobeying this one basic commandment to have God alone as your object of adoration and worship. Let's move to another result of the fall, or result of original sin, and that is an inclination to rebel, to go against God in terms of his expectations of us. And again, back to Isaiah 53, we've all gone astray. We've got that human proclivity toward wandering, straying from, in fact, intentionally mutinying against God's rule in our lives. We've all gone astray. We've all turned our own way. The New Testament, not surprisingly then, will say, for you were continually straying like sheep. There it is. In fact, Peter, one of the closest followers of Jesus, is picking up on that theme of Isaiah. All we like sheep have gone astray. Peter simply rewords that. You were continually straying like sheep. So our inclination is to rebel and to go away from God. Another result of this fallen nature that we have inherited, this proclivity or inclination towards sin, is that we are in bondage to sin. That's another unintended consequence, a negative result of this. You get this in the Dead Sea Scrolls, a picture of some found in their original context or in situ. At one discovery from Cave 1 from Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and the title of this is Serech, or the Community Rule. Now the spirits of truth and injustice, good and bad, struggle in the hearts of men, because God has established the two spirits in equal measure until the determined time. There's some kind of a struggle, some kind of a conflict going on inside of fallen man, And this Dead Sea text is reflecting that. The rabbis, the early rabbis, will do the same. In a person's mother's womb, the evil Yetzer, we talked about this in the first segment of this series, the evil inclination grows in him. This is the rabbis saying this. This is not just Paul, it's not just writers in the Hebrew Bible, but it's these guys between the Testaments are coming with the same kind of idea, but they make it even more explicit. This evil inclination is growing in a human being. As soon as he emerges from the womb, he begins to break the commandments of God. From the first drop that a person puts inside of a woman, the evil Yetzer, the evil inclination, exists. It's already there from conception. From the first moment that an infant is placed in the crib, it is trying to kill you, or to, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is to have you. And the door is understood and being interpreted here by the rabbis as coming from the womb. In 4th Ezra, again, that text that we saw earlier from around the time of the New Testament, and to Adam you commanded only one. And by the way, we're reusing some of the texts that we discussed more fully in the first segment of this series, because we're trying to establish continuity between the first segment and the second segment. Adam was only given one commandment, but he transgressed it. Therefore, you appointed death for him and for his generation. So, a covenantal infraction, and then the result. And every nation walked after his own will, including Jacob's seed. And so, with respect to Jacob's seed, or Israel, you didn't take away from him that evil Yetzer, that evil inclination, because the first Adam, clothing himself with the evil heart, transgressed, likewise also born of him. Why? Because of that inclination that we now all have. Thus, the infirmity became systemic, and the law was in the heart, and yet it existed in conjunction with, living at the same time with the evil germ. So, what was good then departed, and the evil remained. This is exactly the same place that Paul will come out when he says, I delight to do the will of God with my mind, but in the members of my flesh, I end up doing that which is evil. So we get this in Romans chapter 7, this idea of bondage to sin, being enslaved to the power of sin. So Paul will say, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I am sold into bondage to sin. Romans chapter 7, a great opportunity for you to jump off into the entire passage and do that as homework. In Romans 7, Paul will say, also with respect to this bondage to sin, that I find that there's a principle, that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. Remember what the rabbis said. They coexisted, and then eventually the evil overcame the good. So evil is present in the one that wants to do good. So, on the one hand, with my mind, I'm serving the law of God, but on the other side, with my flesh, I'm serving the law of sin. Paul is recognizing exactly what Chazal, or the early rabbis, were saying, is that the two coexist. They're inside of the same human being. More often than not, the evil inclination will overcome the Yetzer Tov, or the good inclination toward good. Paul will also say in Romans chapter 7, I concur with the law of God in the inner man, but I see a law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner. Remember, this component we're talking about here, this particular result is bondage to sin, making me a prisoner, bondage language, of the law of sin which is in my members. So Paul asks this, maybe it's a rhetorical question here in verse 24, wretched man that I am, who will set me free? This is again that language of I'm in bondage, and I yearn to be free from that bondage, that position of prisoner. Who will set me free from the body of this death? And we're going to talk more about death as being a result of the fall and of our evil inclination. But Paul is yearning for freedom from this bondage caused by sin that has come down to us in a manner of our inheritance, our being a part of the same human race. Who will set me free? So he's looking forward to some point of redemption. Another component, another result, consequence, unintended consequence of fall, of mutiny, of rebellion against the ways of God, is that we end up being judged by God. Because he is righteous, because he is even-handed, he looks at that which is displeasing to him, not in accordance with the covenant or agreement that he has made with us, and he ends up having to decree, this is good, this is not good. So totally expected in this kind of situation. We have to have judgments rendered in our modern Western context as well by judges and justices, etc. So not surprising then that this is an act of God as a result of the rebellion. In the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, the principle that is set forth is that everyone will be put to death for his own sin. So it's expected there will be sin, and that the person that who commits the sin of death, and there are 36 different covenant infractions in the Torah that the rabbis describe, that receive the sentence of death. So what we've got is those who sins will be put to death. That's just a principle set forth in the Torah, and there are tons of examples of where that is carried out or fleshed out in with respect to specific situations throughout the Torah, throughout the book of Exodus, the book of Numbers, the book of Leviticus, etc., and then Deuteronomy just kind of sums it all up. Here's a specific example. During the divided kingdom period, we have parallel passages in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, but people who commit premeditated murder, they will be put to death, but for their own sin. Their sons won't be, the rest of their family won't be, but each individual is put to death for his own sin. So again, there's this connection between sin and the sentence of death. In the prophet Jeremiah, everyone will die, there's death, for his own iniquity or sins, not for other people's. It's not some sort of a collective, but each person is going to die for his own iniquity. Ezekiel, a contemporary of Jeremiah, says the same thing. The soul of the one who sins is the one that will die. Again, connection between sin, covenantal breach, and the consequence or result, which is death. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, and again, what we're doing is we're using this material between the Testaments to show continuity, connectedness, and development that continues throughout this material. Things in this world don't typically just pop up as brand new. Typically, we're going to see things in germ in the Hebrew Bible, continuing to develop through the intertestamental period, and then appearing full-blown in the New Testament. That tends to be a typical developmental flow. So, in 1Q Hodayot, in the Thanksgiving hymns from Cave 1 at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls say that who is just when judged in your presence? It's a rhetorical question. Nobody. We stand before God, and because of this inherited sin and the fact that we then express it regularly in our behavior, then we, when standing in judgment, none of us can be declared righteous. No spirit can reply to your reproach or your rebuke. No one can stand up against your anger. So says the text in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We all stand before God condemned, not only by nature, but also by the fact that we have followed through, carried out that fallen nature within us by lying, stealing, coveting, killing, etc., in our own lifetime. Romans chapter 5, much the same. by the transgression of the one, meaning Adam, the many, meaning the rest of humankind, died. The connection between sin and death. The judgment arose. Notice that we're dealing with God having to sit in judgment of things that are outside of, contrary to his nature, and that are infractions or breaking of the covenant between God and man. The judgment arose from one transgression resulting in condemnation. So judgment and being found guilty. By the transgression of the one, then death reigned through the one. So, again, an interesting connection between transgression or sin and death. In Romans 5, through one transgression or sin, there resulted condemnation. There's again the language of judgment to all men. Again, that this has touched everybody. Nobody is outside the circle. We are all connected, not only genetically, but also by this disposition toward and then carrying out these acts of disobedience that don't reflect the nature of God properly in our world. Through the one man's disobedience, the many were made sinners. And there's another connection with this business of original sin, or that we are all of this same Adamic, Adam-like nature. Now we go to another consequence. We're just building one on top of another, and so the next logical segment, piece of this discussion is that death is a natural outgrowth or consequence of this kind of like covenant rebellion. So in the book of Genesis, the Lord commanded the man, and he said, you can eat anything that you want to eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, because in the day that you eat from it, you will surely die. So we're connecting the passages now that deal with the sin and then death. So when you commit a covenant infraction, when you disobey a command from God, then you will surely die. So there's that death component as a unintended consequence. The woman said, here's another kind of a restatement of the same. We can eat from any of the trees except the one that is in the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God said, you shall not eat from it, don't even touch it, lest you die. And unfortunately, she knew more than she was able to fulfill, and that indeed took place. Ezekiel, from the prophets, we had in Genesis the Torah, now we're getting the prophets. All souls are mine, the soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son. It's the soul that sins that will die. So the connection between sin and death. Here's another text. Now we've moved from Hebrew Bible times into that intertestamental period. Ben Sira comes to us as an apocryphal text. It comes to us from the year 220 BC, possibly as late as 200 BC. So right in the middle of the intertestamental period, Ben Sira says, from a woman did sin originate. So sins in the world, he's tracking it back to the instance in the garden, Adam and Eve, and that original covenant breach. And he says, because of her, we all must die. There is again that connection between sin and the consequence, not intended. That never was Adam and Eve's goal, we're certain of that, but the unintended consequence is death. Here again from the rabbis. The early rabbis say that Moses pleaded, I've not committed any of the 36 infractions that are mentioned in the Torah deserving of death, and so why are you decreeing death upon me? And God replied, you are to die because of the sin of the first man. Another connection back to the sin of Adam and Eve, who brought death, the sin of the first man who brought death into the world. So definitely unintended consequence, but a consequence nonetheless. The connection between covenant infraction and unintended consequence of death. Paul will follow right in suit with the rabbis, with 4th Ezra, with all of these, with the Dead Sea text, etc., with what we get all the way back into the Hebrew Bible, and he says, So just as though, as through one man, sin entered into the world, and death came through sin. I mean, this is totally connecting those two dots, but it's not new with Paul. He's not breaking up new ground here. He is simply furthering the tradition that starts in the Hebrew Bible, that continues between the Testaments, and that now achieves maybe its full-blown form or most clear expression in death came through sin. And so death spread to all men. Again, there's that connection with we're all in this together. We're all of like nature. We all have that inclination in the direction of rebellion and mutiny. And then why is it because death spread to all men? Is it just something kind of a broad brush that God does? That he says, look, I don't really care, what percentage of your life you sin and you obey, or it doesn't make any difference how, who your parents are or whatever. I'm just painting everybody with a broad brush, kind of a kill them all, let God sort them out sort of attitude. No, this is death spread to all men because all men sinned. Is there any doubt that we are self-centered by nature, that we're consistently tilting the table in our direction? Is there any doubt when, even as children, young children, we want to be the center of attention and we want our needs met first? And it doesn't really matter that we're on a plane full of 250 people. I'm hungry, or my ears won't pop and they're hurting because of compression, decompression, etc. That's the way human nature happens to be. You ever met anybody who said, you know what, I am sinless. I have never hurt anyone. I've always brought blessing. I've always given rather than taken. It's never about me. I've always been pouring myself out in service to other people. Ever met anybody like that? And a survey says, no, we haven't. So you and I, we're just being honest together here. We're admitting together that we're all in this together and we're all of like nature. All have sinned. All have sinned. And so Paul is saying, consequently, death has spread to all men. Definitely that connection between sin and death. By the transgression of one, the many died. By the transgression of one, death reigned through the one. So, doesn't get any clearer than this. And Paul is kind of at the end of the train. He's the caboose, and he's tying all these things together. But there has been this consistent emphasis from Hebrew Bible through the intertestamental period and on into the days of Jesus and the apostles. Paul will say, the wages of sin is death. Direct connection. Here's what you get. By one man, 1 Corinthians, this is Paul still, by a man came death, and in Adam all die. Not new with Paul. Saw it in 4th Ezra, saw it in the rabbis, seeing it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, etc., but just receiving a very clear expression in the letters of Paul within the New Testament. So there's a final component of this discussion of the results or consequences. I know that there are others. I'm certain that I've missed a few, and we don't have time to do them all, but at least we can end on a high note, because despite the fact that we've sinned, we've displeased God, there's been this separation, alienation, unintended consequences like death have come in and the like. There's also this recognition by people in all times. We're talking thousands of years of Revelation history that water under the bridge, and everybody's recognizing we need rescue. There's a universal recognition throughout all of these various literatures at different time periods. There's a need for a redemption. Everybody's recognizing that. And there's a need for human beings and God to be reconciled. We're actually going to do a full segment on this business of rescue, redemption, and reconciliation. So this is simply a kind of, again, an overview, a flyover. This is the prayer that Solomon prayed. It's in the former prophets, or what is called in the West the historical books. But this is the prayer that was prayed by Solomon as he's dedicating the temple, that point of contact between God and man. And he says, when they sin against you, and then you deliver them up and they're taken away captive, if they return to you with all their heart and soul, then this is his prayer. Hear their prayer of repentance. Forgive your people. Forgive their transgressions and draw them back into your direction. Isaiah will say the same thing. We've all gone astray. We've all turned our own way. But the Lord has caused the iniquity of all of us to fall on him. The question is, who is the him? And that will have to be dealt with in another segment in this same series. And indeed, we will give full treatment to that. But the point is that God has a plan to take sin, the load of sin, responsibility of sin, off of fallen humanity and place it on someone that Isaiah calls him. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find again in 1Q Hodayot, or the Thanksgiving hymns, what is someone born of a woman? And he's a structure of dust that's shaped in water. His base nature is the guilt of sin. And so do we have any hope at all? Is it just like, well, I guess if that's the way that we're built on the inside, we just roll over and give up, and God just writes us off and out of his covenant? But no, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's 2nd century BC, between the Testaments, this author is saying that it's only by your goodness, it's by God's mercy, it's by God's grace, it's by that part of his nature that compels him to pursue us. It's only by your goodness that man is, whoa, here we go again with this language of that judgment is the result of sin. A man is acquitted by God's mercy, his favor, his goodness. So there is hope. There's something on the horizon that God is able to accomplish that we can't do for ourselves. It is only by his goodness that man is acquitted and purified by his abundant compassion. Thank God for that. And watch how this theme develops. In the book of Romans, God demonstrates his love in that while we were still sinners, he doesn't wait for us to clean ourselves up. He doesn't wait for someone else to come along and wave a magic wand. He doesn't wait for some perfect person to finally be born that he can be pleased with. While we were all still in our point of rebellion, of mutiny against his rule in our lives, this is what Paul says, Christ died for us. Maybe that's what Isaiah is talking about when he took the iniquity of all of us and put it on him. See how all these streams run together? Do you see how there's, between all of these various authors in these different time periods, there's continuity? And so this is Paul summing these things up yet again. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. He put upon him the iniquity of us all. Now, just to conclude, a couple of longer passages from Paul and the book of Romans. He says, we have been saved by the wrath of God. Please go back and look at this in its full context. If while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son. And having been reconciled, then through whom we have now received the reconciliation. We've got that language of we have been reconciled with God. There is a possibility. There's a lifeline. We're not just written out of history because, well, one guy blew it and we've all, for thousands of years and thousands of generations, we've all followed suit and we're all guilty of some sort of covenantal infraction that disqualifies us from relationship with the living and holy God. And yet, there's the beauty of it, and yet we've been reconciled through the death of his Son. Romans 5 again. Through one transgression, though one transgression resulted in condemnation for all men, even so through one act of righteousness, he's referring to the death of Jesus, voluntary sacrifice, there resulted justification. And that word is a technical term that means that the judge pounds the gavel and says to all present in the courtroom, I declare you innocent of charges against you. You are acquitted. You are justified. You are found innocent in my sight. There resulted justification. And as through the one man's disobedience many were made sinners, even so through the obedience of the one. Yeah, he laid on him the iniquity of us all. Through the obedience of one person, the many will be made righteous. In the same way that we were almost destined by Adam's sin that set the precedent to follow suit, so also by the obedience of one, now we can all stand in God's presence, and he will declare us in right standing with him. These are the kinds of things, guys, that we do on a regular basis at Bible Unplugged. We do it in the land of Israel. We also do it here in the studio when we're trying to share with you and string the pearls, connect the dots. This is what God has called us to do. We put the material in front of you so that you can interact with it, so you have the opportunity to see the same data that I'm working with in the laboratory when I'm coming to my conclusions, when I'm doing the work of connecting the dots throughout the hundreds and thousands of years of this tradition, from Hebrew Bible through the intertestamental period and on to its full expression in the New Testament. I trust that this is a blessing to you. I trust that also, if it's a blessing, that you're going to use this, mention it to friends and family that you feel like will benefit, and that this material ends up getting out to more and more people in that way. So thanks for joining us in yet another episode of Bible Unplugged, and I'm looking forward to continuing this series on first things, back to the basics, with you in the next episode. God bless you richly as you serve him this week.